What's going on, y'all? Shout out to the LDBC. It's your boy Fight Critic here to give you guys another video. And since we are in the beginning of the year, and of course, being that boxing is very unpredictable, I felt it would have been a good time to go through the 5 current boxing champions whose careers are being wasted. Now, of course, this list is going to piss off a lot of people, and frankly, I don't care. But I do feel the need that we have to talk about this, especially because there are right now what I feel is 5 current champions who there's really no direction in their careers. And at the same time, they're not getting much of a push from their promoter to get the elevated fights that we like to see in the sport. But for me to make this list, because I could have easily made a list of 20 fighters whose careers are being wasted, I wanted to focus on the guys who are champions because we hold the champions to very high standards. And at the same time, I wanted to make this a lot more challenging for myself. So what I did do is I looked at 4 basic rules for me to rank these guys. So I first wanted legitimate champions. So no interims, no regular champions, no franchise champions. I want the guy who has the legit title because that's the guy who's the legit champion. The second rule is only one fighter per division. So it's really easy to look at a division and find a couple different guys. And in fact, there's a couple divisions that have a couple of champions that you don't really know what the fuck is going on with them. But for me, this second rule was really important because it allowed me to look at that division at a specific lens and choose who I felt was not in the best position compared to whoever else in the division could be having their career wasted. The third rule is these guys are in the worst position compared to their respective champions in the divisions, which comes off of rule number 2, where you would look at all 4 champions or 4 champions and a lineal champion, and you would decide, well, who out of these top 4 or 5 fighters that control the balance of power in the division are in the worst spot. And then my final rule is when ranking them 5 all the way to 1, I did it based on how good the fighter is as opposed to how bad their situation is. So while each guy on this list is in a bad position, when in terms of the level of when you look at their talent, I based them based on that. So you will see a couple guys who may have a lot better talent, but they'll be more up on that list versus the guys who don't have as much talent are lower on this list. I chose to stay away from their situations because just about each guy is in a spot where if they were to take the fight that pushes them over, it would neutralize the ranking of that list. So I chose to build it off the talent perspective as opposed to the situation perspective. But without further ado, let's jump into it. So coming in at number 5, we have Ryota Murat, who is promoted by Top Rank. He is the WBA Super World Middleweight Champion with a record of 16-2 with 13 knockouts. And for Ryota Murat, he has 3 big wins under his resume. And frankly, a lot of these wins came at a time where he wasn't really considered to be the best guy in the division, which is very lackluster. But he has the win over Hassan Ndam, which Ndam had a record of 36-2. He won his WBA World Regular Middleweight title. When he fought Rob Brandt was 25-1, and he had won the WBA Super World Middleweight Championship. And for many people, the Ndam and Brandt fights were actual fights in which Murata was actually avenging a loss, where he kind of got screwed in the Ndam fight, in my opinion, and then he won the rematch. And then Brandt clearly beat him in the first fight, and then he managed to correct his mistakes and beat Brandt in the second fight. But his last defense is definitely probably his third. It's probably one of the best wins on it. And granted, these best 3 wins, I'm not ranking them in any order. I'm just looking at what seems to be a milestone in the fighter's career that I have to place on there. So for Stephen Butler, who had a record of 28-1-1 going into it, there's not much really into it. So for Murata, he ends up retaining his WBA Super World Middleweight title. But when you look at the 160-pound division, there are other champions in the divisions that Murata could fight. You have Jamall Charlo, who's 31-0, and he's the WBC World Middleweight Champion. You have Gennady Golovkin, who is 41-1-1. He is the IBF World Middleweight Champion. And then you have Dmitry Pilav, who's 29-0, and he's the WBO World Middleweight Champion. And of course, you have noteworthy competition. So you have Canelo Alvarez, who's 54-1-2, and then you have Sergey Derevyanchenko, who's 13-3. Now, of course, you're asking yourself, why is Ryota Murat's career being wasted at this point? Well, number one, he's not made a name for himself in America where the other middleweights primarily fight. He has fought in America, but he hasn't really made a name for himself, so there's not much of anybody who really cares what he's doing right now. Number two, the other fighters in his divisions have better marquee fights at 160, which involves the fact that Jamall Charlo has fought Sergey Derevyanchenko. Gennady Golovkin has a vast, long list of middleweight fights that all supersede what Murata has done so far. And Demetrius Andrade, despite the fact that he has the most lackluster of the three champions, his middleweight championship defense is pretty much, if not on par, it's slightly better than Murata. And the big difference here is that Murata has seen himself being elevated as a champion, where Demetrius Andrade went out and won a title. So for Murata, you would probably have to ask yourself, well, what's the best thing that he could do? Well, fight another champion or fight a noteworthy competitor. That's why I've listed these 5 guys here in terms of what he can do next to pull himself out of there. So let's move quite along. And this next one kind of hurts me a little bit to put on here. And that is Jamall Herring. I'm a big fan of Jamall Herring. I think he's a really good feel-good story. I think the way that he's turned around his career and really like zoned in and kind of fixed the corrections that needed to be, make the corrections that needed to be made. He's plugged in all the holes that were pretty much exposed into his game plan and his preparation and how he fought. And ultimately, him moving down a division made a ton of sense because he was originally fighting at lightweight. So for him to move down from 135 pounds to 130 pounds, it made all the sense in his career, and he is promoted by Top Rank. And he is currently the WBO World Super Featherweight Champion. He has a record of 22-2 with 10 knockouts. And his best 3 wins are Masayuki Ito, which Ito had a record of 25-1-1, and he won his WBO Super Featherweight title in that fight. And then, of course, his next 2 best wins, in my opinion, are Lamont Roach, who had a record of 19 wins, 0 losses, and a draw, and he retained that same title. And then most recently, Jonathan Oquendo, who was 31-6, and Herring would retain his title on a DQ. Now, I know a lot of people felt kind of weird about Herring leaving that fight, but compared to the other guys that are on his list and the fact that the only other big name guys that were competitors beat Herring, it kind of had no choice but to force me to put Oquendo on this list, in my opinion. But if there's another one that you feel is better, where Herring was really going in and we didn't know how to make much of it, feel free to drop it in the comment section. But when you look at the 130-pound division, there are other champions that Herring can pursue. You've got Gervonta Davis, who's 24-0. He is the WBA Super World Super Featherweight Champion. You have Miguel Berchelt, who is 37-1. He is the WBC World Super Featherweight Champion. And then you have Joseph Jojo Diaz, who is 31-1 and the IBF World Super Featherweight Champion. And then you've got noteworthy competition with Tevin Farmer, who was the former IBF World Super Featherweight Champion. And then you have Oscar Valdez, who is moving up in weight, and he will actually fight Miguel Berchelt for the WBC World Super Featherweight Championship. Well, for Herring, why is Jamall Herring's career being wasted at this point? Well, number one, he's no longer an overachiever in my opinion. And while it was an amazing feel-good story to watch him become a world champion, you now have to look at the fact that Herring is now expected to do the things that other champions are required to do. The level of opposition that he fought going into his title defense and the level of opposition that we need to see him fight at this point is much different, especially when you look at guys like Davis, Berchelt, and Jojo Diaz. So what can he do? Well, what is he doing as well is he's not really being shown the ability to go out and get these fights. So everybody else at the top is currently fighting each other. And then you also have to factor in the fact that he's going to fight Carl Frampton. But does a win over Frampton help him? Because Frampton's best days are behind him. And Frampton is moving up in weight. And Frampton, of course, a guy who was originally a 122-pound fighter, then, of course, moved up to 126, and now going up to 130. You have to wonder if a guy like him is actually going to be able to work with the massive size difference of Herring, who's naturally a lightweight. So we'll see how it happens. They are scheduled to fight pretty soon, and it's a fight that I'm looking forward to. But while I do believe that Herring should win that fight, probably rather comfortably, I don't know if it's going to do as much for me to propel him off of this list. Coming in at number 3, and this should be really no surprise at all, is Gary Russell Jr. He is promoted by a PBC affiliate promoter, and he holds the WBC World Featherweight Championship. So for Gary Russell Jr., he has a record of 31-1 with 18 knockouts, and his best 3 wins are Johnny Gonzalez, who had a record of 57-8, in which he won his WBC featherweight title. He then retained the titles against Jojo Diaz, who was undefeated at the time, and then you had Kiko Martinez, pretty much a full-on polished journeyman in the sport, who had a record of 39-8-2. So for Gary Russell Jr., there are other champions in his division that he could definitely fight. Leo Santa Cruz is basically and probably the best one at this point in terms of who he could fight. He has a record of 37-2-1, and despite the fact that Leo Santa Cruz did get absolutely stretched by Gervonta Davis not too long ago, he still retains the WBA, and I don't know why I spelled super wrong. And fixed. And did I fuck this up also above? No, these are spelled correctly. Cool. So with Gary Russell Jr., he can fight Leo Santa Cruz, who is the Super World Featherweight Champion. And then you've got Emmanuel Navarrete, who is 32-1-0-1, meaning that he has 32 wins, 1 loss, no draws, with 1 no contests. And he's the WBO World Featherweight Champion. And of course, you're probably wondering why the IBF has no featherweight champion. And that's because in a noteworthy competition, Josh Warrington, who is 30-0, vacated his title. Why? Because the other guy that's on his list, Zhu Khan, who's 18-2, the IBF would not recognize Khan as a legitimate belt holder. And that's because Zhu Khan has the regular WBA title. Josh Warrington wanted his title and Zhu Khan's title to be considered a legitimate unification fight, even though Leo Santa Cruz is still the belt holder. So Josh Warrington, rather than being a real champion and choosing to fight Kid Galahad in a rematch, which would probably be the best option, he chose to discard his title and not want to be a champion. So Gary Russell Jr., honestly, you have Zhu Khan and then you have Kid Galahad, and those are 2 really good fights that you could take to take you off of here. Of course, you could unify against Leo Santa Cruz, and then everybody's fucking happy about it. But we do have to ask the question is, why is Gary Russell Jr.'s career being wasted at this point? Well, number one, he's lazy. And you've kind of seen it. He doesn't look like a guy who spends a lot of time really putting himself out there as a fighter. I think if Gary Russell Jr. was walking on the street in probably one of the most jam-packed places for boxing, not many people would recognize him because he just doesn't really do much. He's a bit of an introvert. The second reason is because he's got legit pound-for-pound talent, but he only fights 1 time per year. And he really, really embraces only fighting 1 time a year, which for many of us, we're like, no, that's not the kind of shit that you want to tell us, my friend, because we're not going to care for your fights. And of course, the third reason why his career is being wasted is when he does fight that 1 time, it's very hit or miss of who is he going to actually fight. And yes, he's fought really good fighters at times, but we're more excited about the Jojo Diaz fight, but Kiko Martinez does absolutely nothing for us. You know, so for Gary Russell Jr., being active, caring about your career, and then trying to fight the other guys and put pressure on them does way more than spending 3 weeks beefing with Devin Haney just to give us false hopes. But that's Gary Russell's junior career pretty much. So next we'll move on to number 2, which is Dmitry Pilav, who is promoted by Matchroom. And Dmitry Pilav is the WBA Super World Light Heavyweight Champion. He is 17-0 with 11 knockouts. Now for Dmitry Pilav, he's got 3 good wins, and that's Sullivan Barrera, who was 21-1, and he retained the WBO World Light Heavyweight title. He would then defend that same regular title against Jean Pascal, who had a record of 33 wins, 5 losses, 1 draw, 1 no contest. And then, of course, he would then retain the title yet again, beating Joe Smith Jr., who had a record of 24-2. And then afterwards, Dmitry Pilav would be elevated to the super champion in the division. But 175 pounds has a lot of other really good champions, and it's really just one other really good champion, and that is Artur Beterbiev, who is 15-0. He's knocked out everybody he's fought, and he's the WBC and the IBF Unified World Light Heavyweight Champion. And for Beterbiev, he's the man to beat, and there's no other guy there except for him for Dmitry Pilav to fight, because there is no WBO light heavyweight champion. And right now, Joe Smith Jr. and Maxim Vlasov are going to more than likely fight for that vacant title they're scheduled to. And if Joe Smith Jr. does win that fight, then yeah, a rematch versus Pilav then seems to be really, really likely. But if Maxim Vlasov gets it, it would almost be a no-brainer to put him in the ring with Dmitry Pilav and unify the titles. But until then, there's really only one guy that he should really have his mind on, and that's Beterbiev. But there are noteworthy competitors. You have Canelo Alvarez, who dabbles at light heavyweight from time to time. You have Sergey Kovalev, who, despite the fact he's tested positive for a banned substance, he is still a guy you could fight. But then you also got guys like Marcus Brown, who's 23-1, and then Badu Jack, who's 23-3-3. And while Jack and Brown don't hold the same type of level of competition standards that a Kovalev and Alvarez do, the reason why his career is being wasted is his 3 best wins is he's missing the right time to fight these opponents. Sullivan Barrera, John Pascal, Joe Smith Jr. all pretty much had not been at their peaks when he fought them. And for a guy like Sullivan Barrera, he didn't really do much with the win over Shabransky. And for Jean Pascal, you never know what you're going to get with Pascal in the fight. And for Joe Smith Jr., we don't really have high standards for him. So when he's not really catching these guys at the right moment as a champion, and when you look at the opportunity to fight a Marcus Brown and Badu Jack, while those guys would be considered in the same tier of not catching him at the right moment, those guys on his resume still look good in terms of noteworthy competition. But there is a couple more reasons why his career is being wasted. There's an unrealistic expectation that he puts out there that he could make super middleweight. If Dmitry Pilav could make super middleweight, and I say this about a ton of fighters who talk about fighting in different weight classes, you would do it. It's that simple. If you wanted to fight at super middleweight, you would do it. And you would honestly move down in weight and take a fight for it. But he hasn't. So because of that, that is an unrealistic expectation in my opinion. And lastly, he doesn't seem pressured by boxing media or fans to take the really big fights. And this tends to be a thing with guys, especially guys who are not American-based when it comes to them becoming a champion. There is little to no pressure on them to take a bigger fight, especially if they're a guy with not a lot of fights or their resume is very, very lackluster and they're a champion. Most people tend to put their attention on other guys in the division and hold them to higher standards. So when you had light heavyweight, which had Adonis Stevenson, Alexander Vozdik, Beterbiev, Ward, and Kovalev, nobody really cared much for Dmitry Pilav. And because of that, he was allowed to become a champion, a legitimate elevated champion, because so many of these guys were focused on putting the pressure on the other guys in the division. And because of that, that is why Pilav's career is where it is right now. But there is one guy who is ranked ahead of Dmitry Pilav, and it shouldn't come at a surprise. It's Terence Crawford. And yeah, it's hard for a guy with this level of a resume to be considered the most wasted champion at this point. But for Terence Crawford, there's a lot behind it. He's promoted by Top Rank. He's got a big promoter behind him. He's a WBO World Welterweight Champion. And he's 37-0 with 28 knockouts. And his best 3 wins are Yuriorkis Gamboa, who was 23-0 when he retained his WBO World Light Welterweight Championship. In fact, I actually have to adjust this because it wasn't even that title. It was the Lightweight Championship that he retained. There we go. So yes, he retained the WBO World Lightweight title when he defeated Yuriorkis Gamboa. And then after he had moved up in weight, he beat Victor Postal, who was 28-0. He retained the WBO World Light Welterweight title, and he won the WBC World Light Welterweight title. Thus, he became a unified champion. And then he took it one step further when he beat Julius Ndongo, who was 22-0 at the time. He retained both the WBO and the WBC. There we go. He retained the WBO and WBC World Light Welterweight titles, and he won the WBA Super World and the IBF World Light Welterweight titles, becoming both the undisputed and lineal World Lightweight Champion. This is the absolute peak of what any fighter can do in their division. Hold all the major titles and be considered the lineal champion. That is something that only Crawford and Alexander Usyk have done in this current modern era of champions. And it's no reason for us to downplay it. So when people downplay this accomplishment, they tend to be shitting on what they want every fighter to do in their division. But at welterweight, Crawford's resume has been horrible. And when you look at the other champions, there's no excuse for it. Manny Pacquiao is 62-7-2. And he's the WBA Super World Welterweight Champion. Errol Spence is 27-0, and he's the WBC and IBF Unified World Welterweight Champion. And then you've got noteworthy competitors like Keith Thurman, who's 29-1-0-1, Sean Porter, who's 31-3-1, and Danny Garcia, who is 36-3. All these guys are way better than what Crawford has fought so far at welterweight. And there are these big key reasons why Terence Crawford's career is being wasted at this point, and a lot of it has to do around money. Number one, he's outpricing himself versus the other champions. He expects to receive 60% of the revenue split fighting Errol Spence. That is unrealistic. And it's unrealistic because Errol Spence Jr., in terms of the revenue that he's generated through ticket sales and pay-per-view, vastly outpaces Crawford. And something to a degree where if you were to put their percentages and their generated revenue up against each other, you could make a monetary claim that Errol Spence probably deserves somewhere close to 80% of the revenue. And then, of course, he has overpaid lesser competition, with Amir Khan making $5 million and Kell Brook making $2 million. And the reason why this is such a big mistake for him to do is these guys that are noteworthy competitors between Thurman, Porter, and Garcia, they are considered to be better opposition than Khan and Brook, and your promoter doesn't want to pay them more than what Amir Khan made. And that isn't something that doesn't fly with those guys. If you're willing to pay Amir Khan $5 million, you should be willing to pay all three of these noteworthy competitors the same amount of money. And you're not even offering them the $2 million that Brook made. You've seen guys talk about they're only being offered $1 million to even sometimes maybe close to $2 million to fight Terence Crawford, and these guys have actual audiences. Keith Thurman could fight right now, barring COVID, and put an arena of 10 to 15,000 people there. Sean Porter, same thing. Danny Garcia, maybe more closer to 15,000. So these guys are used to making the kind of money that Kell Brook was making and more. These guys are also used to making the kind of money that Khan makes and potentially more for bigger fights. So when you're offering these guys less than what Khan made and right around what Brook made, it's you telling them that they're on the same level of a Khan or Brook in this market, and these guys outpace Khan and Brook in this market. And last but not least, he's at odds with his promoter while also taking the lackluster fights. And for Terence Crawford, this is something that you don't want to do when you are a fighter. And that is beef with your promoter, but also at the same time that you're beefing your promoter, you're taking the shit fights that they're giving you. And it doesn't help your case. You need to force your promoter to make the absolute full investment on getting these guys, whether it's Pacquiao, Spence, Thurman, Porter, or Garcia, into the ring. And yes, it's going to cost money, but Bob Arum isn't even second guessing the amount of money he has to spend to get Joshua and Fury to fight each other. But yet he's second guessing you. That is a problem. And that's where you need to turn your attention to. But until that happens, you are probably the only boxing champion right now in terms of talent who is getting his career wasted the most. So those are my top 5. Ryota Murat, Jamall Herring, Gary Russell Jr., Dmitry Pilav, and Terence Crawford. And might I tell you, 3 guys on this list have totally different promoters. And at the same time, there is no Golden Boy Promotions fighter on here, which is kind of surprising. But then again, they don't really have much champions these days. And on the flip side, this list, in my opinion, is very balanced. It's not pro or con heavy anything. It has guys who have different outlooks on their divisions, different promoters behind them, and ultimately every one of these picks, in my opinion, feels justified. Now, if you looked at any of these divisions right now on the what seems to be million divisions that we have in boxing, and you feel like there's another guy that belongs on this list more, then please comment down below. Tell me why. And no, don't just throw in a name and just say that person does, because I can easily pick apart that argument. But until then, it is what it is. Thank you all for watching, and if you haven't yet, please like, comment, subscribe. And this will probably be my last video for a couple days, getting ready to put all my energy into the Golden Boy series in episode 3.